When I first arrived in Montana Territory in the fall of 1883, I didn't come with a plan to challenge tradition. I came with my family, a wagon, and the simple goal of surviving the winter without losing fingers, livestock, or hope. Like everyone else, I expected to build a rectangular cabin. That was the way it had always been done. Straight walls, sharp corners, a peaked roof, and a fireplace shoved against one wall. No one questioned it because it was familiar. Familiar often feels safe, especially when the cold can kill you, but familiarity doesn't always mean efficiency. I had worked with stone most of my life, long before I ever set foot in Montana. Stone teaches you patience. It also teaches you respect. You learn quickly that stone doesn't like to be forced into shapes it doesn't want to take. The river stones near my land were smooth, rounded, shaped by centuries of water and movement. Trying to make them fit sharp corners felt wrong, wasteful, and unnecessary. Every time I imagined stacking them into right angles, I saw hours of cutting, cracking, and throwing good material aside just to satisfy a tradition that didn't serve the environment I was in. The wind in that valley never rested. It came down from the mountains and tore through every gap it could find. I watched it hit the cabins around me, especially at the corners. The wind would slam into those flat walls, stall, then push cold air into every seam. Corners acted like traps for cold. They pulled it in and held it there. Inside those cabins, no matter how much wood was burned, the corners were always cold. Families hung blankets, stacked boxes, and avoided those spaces altogether. It made me wonder why people were building spaces they couldn't even use in winter. At night, I'd sit near my fire and think about heat. Heat doesn't move in straight lines. It spreads outward. It radiates. It flows. Yet we kept building houses as if heat could be ordered to behave differently. A square room forces heat into uneven patterns. The fire warms one wall intensely while the opposite wall stays cold. Warm air rises and gets trapped near the ceiling, leaving the floor icy. People solve this by burning more wood, not by fixing the design. That never made sense to me. The idea of a round cabin didn't come to me as inspiration. It came as a solution. If there were no corners, there would be no places for cold to gather. If the walls curved, the wind would flow around them instead of slamming into them. If the fire sat in the center, heat would move evenly in every direction. The shape itself would work with nature instead of fighting it. That idea stayed with me because it wasn't clever. It was obvious once you stopped assuming things had to be done a certain way. When I laid the foundation, everything became easier instead of harder. The stones fit naturally into the curve. I didn't have to cut them to make them obey an angle. Each one supported the next. The wall became one continuous structure, not four walls tied together at weak points. That alone made the cabin stronger. There was no joint where stress collected. Snow load, wind pressure, and settling earth were distributed evenly across the entire structure. I built the walls thick, nearly 2 feet of solid stone. People thought that was excessive. They didn't understand that stone isn't insulation the way wood is. Stone is storage. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. Once it warms up, it stays warm for a long time. That meant my cabin didn't depend on a constant roaring fire. It depended on time and mass. During the day, the fire warmed the stone. At night, when the fire burned low, the stone gave that heat back. The fireplace sat in the exact center of the cabin. That decision alone changed everything. Heat radiated evenly, reaching every wall at nearly the same intensity. There was no far corner. There was no cold side of the house. When you stood anywhere inside, the temperature felt the same. That kind of comfort doesn't show up on paper, but you feel it in your bones. You stop huddling. You stop hovering near the fire. You live normally, even when it's bitterly cold outside. The roof mattered just as much as the walls. A traditional peaked roof creates a space where heat gathers uselessly. Warm air rises and gets trapped above where people live. My conical roof eliminated that. There was no attic stealing warmth. Heat stayed where it belonged. The shape also shed snow continuously. While my neighbors climbed onto their roofs to shovel or watched beams creak under the weight, mine stayed clear. Wind slid over it instead of lifting it. Snow had nowhere to settle. By the time winter truly arrived, my cabin had already been warming itself for weeks. Stone doesn't heat instantly, but once it does, it becomes stable. When the temperature dropped below zero and stayed there, the cabin didn't panic. It didn't lose heat the moment the fire slowed. Inside, the air stayed calm and steady. The floor stayed warm enough for bare feet. The walls felt alive, gently releasing warmth long after the flames died down. My neighbors were fighting their homes. Every night was a battle. Fires had to be fed constantly. Wood piles shrank faster than anyone expected. Families retreated into single rooms, abandoning half their houses to the cold. Corners became storage for frozen furniture and unused beds. Inside my round cabin, nothing changed. The fire burned smaller. The temperature barely moved. That difference wasn't luck. It was geometry and physics doing what they always do. When measurements were finally taken, the numbers shocked everyone, including me. My cabin wasn't just warmer. It was evenly warmer. The coldest spot in my home was still over 60 degrees, while the warmest spots in rectangular cabins barely reached that. Their coldest corners hovered near freezing. The difference between those cold corners and my walls was nearly 30 degrees. That number mattered because it wasn't about comfort anymore. It was about health, safety, and survival. The wood consumption told the rest of the story. I was burning roughly half of what others burned to stay warmer. That meant less time cutting wood in dangerous weather. Less risk. Less exhaustion. More margin for error. In winter, margin is everything. A single mistake, a single storm, or a single injury can be fatal if you're already stretched thin. My cabin gave my family margin. People asked if it felt strange to live in a round space. It didn't. It felt natural. Furniture fit fine. Movement felt smoother. Sound traveled differently, softer somehow. The space didn't fight us. It supported us. The children played freely instead of staying close to the fire. My wife cooked without gloves. Life went on while winter raged outside. What made the cabin warmer wasn't one clever trick. It was the system working together. The shape, the materials, the placement of the fire, the thickness of the walls, the roof design, and the absence of corners all reinforced each other. Remove one element and the efficiency drops. Together, they created balance. That balance is what kept the temperature steady. I never claimed to invent anything. Indigenous people understood round structures long before I did. Nature itself avoids straight lines and sharp corners. Rivers curve. Hills roll. Wind flows. Heat spreads. When buildings ignore those truths, they require constant effort to maintain comfort. When buildings respect them, Comfort comes naturally. My round stone cabin was 30 degrees warmer in winter because it didn't fight the cold. It managed it. It didn't demand more fuel. It made better use of what it had. It didn't rely on constant human effort. It relied on mass, shape, and time. That is why it worked when others struggled. Winter didn't care about tradition. It didn't care how cabins had always been built. It tested everything equally. And under that test, the round cabin proved that sometimes the safest path forward is simply paying attention to what works, even when it looks different. After that winter, nothing in the valley felt the same. The snow melted eventually, the wind softened, and the river began to run free again, but the memory of those weeks never left anyone who lived through them. People remembered how the cold didn't just test buildings, it tested pride, habits, and assumptions. They remembered who struggled and who didn't. They remembered where they felt relief when the cold became unbearable. And they remembered that the strange round stone cabin they once mocked had quietly done exactly what its builder said it would do. Once the immediate danger passed, people began asking different kinds of questions. Not, why did you build it like that, but, how exactly does it work? They wanted details. They wanted to know how thick the walls really were, how long it took to heat the stone, how the fire was managed, and whether the design could be adapted to their own homes. These weren't idle questions anymore. They were survival questions, asked by people who had burned furniture to stay warm and had watched their children sleep in coats. What surprised many was that the answer wasn't complicated. There was no special fuel, no hidden chamber, no secret venting system. Everything was visible. Everything was honest. The stone walls were there for anyone to touch. The fireplace sat in the open. The roof showed its shape clearly. The cabin didn't rely on clever tricks. It relied on cooperation between elements. That was the hardest thing for people to accept, because it meant the problem hadn't been the winter. The problem had been the way houses were built. As spring approached, a few men began experimenting. Not full round cabins at first, but small changes. One added a curved stone wall to the north side of his cabin to block wind. Another moved his stove closer to the center of his living space. Someone else thickened their walls with stone and earth instead of relying on thin logs alone. None of these changes required abandoning tradition completely, and yet each one made a noticeable difference. Rooms stayed warmer longer. Fires burned slower. Cold drafts weakened. What became clear was that efficiency didn't require perfection. Even partial changes helped. That realization mattered, because not everyone had the skill or resources to build a full stone roundhouse. But everyone could learn from the principles. Shape mattered. Mass mattered. Placement mattered. These weren't opinions anymore. They were lessons written into frost and fuel consumption. Living in the round cabin through a second winter confirmed everything the first winter had proven. The stone warmed earlier, held heat longer, and stayed stable even during sudden temperature drops. While others scrambled to adjust, the cabin stayed calm. There was no rush to feed the fire. No anxiety about running out of wood. Winter became something to endure, not something to fear. Inside, daily life continued with a normal rhythm. Meals were cooked without gloves. Water didn't freeze inside buckets. Tools stayed usable. The children grew up remembering winter not as a time of misery, but as a season with its own quiet beauty. That difference shaped them. Comfort creates space for thought. When you're not fighting the cold, you can focus on living. Visitors often commented on how the air felt different. Not just warm, but steady. There were no hot blasts near the fire and no icy pockets near the walls. That evenness reduced fatigue. Bodies didn't have to constantly adjust. It's a small thing, but small things matter when winter lasts months instead of days. Over time, the ridicule faded completely. The round cabin stopped being that strange building and became a reference point. People would say, "It's not as warm as the round cabin," or, "If only this room held heat like Samuel's place." The idea had entered the local language. Once that happens, change is already underway. Years later, when newcomers arrived and asked why some homes looked different, the story was told again. Not as a boast, but as a lesson. The cold winter. The measurements. The difference. Stories travel farther than blueprints. They carry emotion, memory, and consequence. That's why the idea spread slowly but firmly. The cabin itself aged well. Stone doesn't complain. It doesn't warp. It doesn't shrink away from itself. The walls stayed solid. Mortar needed attention now and then, but that was small work compared to rebuilding log walls eaten by time and weather. The roof needed replacing every decade, but its shape never failed. Snow never crushed it. Wind never tore at it. The structure stayed honest to its purpose. As the years passed, people outside the valley began talking about efficiency in new ways. Some used numbers. Some used theories. But those who had seen the round cabin didn't need convincing. They had felt the difference on their skin. They had smelled the slower burn of wood. They had slept through nights when the wind screamed outside and the walls answered with silence. The lesson wasn't that round buildings were perfect. It was that thought mattered more than habit. Buildings should answer questions, not repeat assumptions. Where does heat go? Where does wind push? Where does cold gather? Once you ask those questions honestly, design becomes simpler, not harder. Looking back, the most important part of the cabin wasn't its warmth. It was what it changed in people's thinking. It showed that survival didn't depend on doing what had always been done. It depended on doing what worked. That idea stayed long after the stones themselves weathered. The round cabin eventually stood empty. Families moved on. Times changed. New materials arrived. But the foundation remained, still marking a perfect circle in the earth. Even collapsed, it taught its lesson. Geometry doesn't forget. Physics doesn't argue. The ground remembers what worked. Why my round stone cabin was 30 degrees warmer in winter was never about me. It was about listening. Listening to stone. Listening to wind. Listening to heat. And most of all, listening to reality instead of tradition. Winter taught the lesson harshly, but clearly. And those who paid attention carried that knowledge forward, one warm room at a time. As time moved forward, the world outside the valley began to change, but the lessons of that round stone cabin stayed quietly relevant. New materials appeared, new tools were invented, and new ways of building spread across the land. Houses became faster to construct and easier to reproduce, but they also became thinner, lighter, and more dependent on constant energy input. People no longer built for winter itself. They built for convenience, assuming fuel would always be available to correct any mistake in design, yet the basic laws that governed heat never changed. Warm air still rose. Cold air still searched for weak points. Wind still punished flat surfaces and sharp angles. Thermal mass still stored energy better than empty space. The round cabin didn't stop working just because time moved on. Its principles remained true. Even when people forgot them, years later, when people spoke about efficiency, they often framed it as something modern, something technical, something dependent on machines and measurements. But the truth was simpler. Efficiency had always been about respect. Respect for climate. Respect for materials. Respect for how nature behaves when left alone. The round cabin succeeded because it respected those things instead of trying to overpower them. One of the quiet truths revealed by the cabin was how much energy people waste compensating for poor design. Burning more wood, adding more blankets, sealing gaps again and again, these were not solutions. They were responses to failure. The cabin didn't ask for constant correction. Once built, it simply worked. That reliability reduced stress in ways that were hard to measure but easy to feel. Another lesson was humility. The cabin reminded people that innovation doesn't always mean inventing something new. Sometimes it means noticing what has always been there and choosing not to ignore it. Indigenous structures, ancient stone dwellings, and natural forms had carried these ideas long before settlers arrived. The round cabin didn't replace that knowledge. It echoed it. People who later visited the foundation site often commented on how peaceful it felt. Even in ruin, the circle felt intentional. There was no sense of collapse or chaos, only the slow return of stone to earth. That quiet ending felt appropriate. The cabin had done its job. It had proven its point. It didn't need to last forever to matter. When winter came year after year, those who had adapted even part of the design noticed the difference. Slight curves softened wind. Heavier walls slowed heat loss. Central heat sources reduced cold pockets. None of this required belief. It required observation. Once people felt the improvement, they didn't need convincing again. The most powerful legacy of the round stone cabin was not that others copied it exactly, but that they started asking better questions. Why does this room feel colder than that one? Why does the fire need constant feeding? Why does the wind always seem to find this wall? Those questions led to better homes, even when the shapes remained familiar. In many ways, the cabin served as a reminder that comfort is not luxury. In harsh environments, comfort is safety. Warmth preserves health. Stability preserves energy. A well-designed shelter gives people the strength to endure challenges beyond the weather. When shelter fails, everything else becomes harder. Looking back, the cabin's success was never dramatic. There were no grand announcements or formal recognition. Its influence spread through conversations, measurements, and quiet decisions made by families who wanted warmer nights and safer winters. That kind of change lasts longer than trends. Why my round stone cabin was 30 degrees warmer in winter ultimately comes down to one idea. I stopped asking how houses were supposed to be built and started asking how heat actually behaves. Once I did that, the shape, materials, and layout followed naturally. The cabin wasn't clever. It was honest. Even today, when technology promises solutions to every problem, the cabin's lesson remains valuable. Before adding complexity, look at form. Before adding energy, look at structure. Before forcing nature to comply, ask how to cooperate with it. The round stone cabin didn't defeat winter. It respected it. And in doing so, it turned one of the harshest seasons into something manageable, predictable, and even peaceful. That is why it stayed warmer. That is why it used less wood. And that is why its story still matters. Sometimes progress isn't about moving forward. Sometimes it's about standing still long enough to notice what already works. Standing still long enough to notice what already works is harder than it sounds. People are trained to move, to build quickly, to fix problems by adding more effort instead of asking why the problem exists in the first place. The round stone cabin taught a different kind of patience. It showed that the most effective solutions often appear slow, even stubborn, because they resist urgency and instead rely on balance. When winter arrived year after year, the cabin did not demand attention. That alone made it valuable. A house that constantly needs fixing steals time and energy from everything else. In contrast, a house that holds steady gives its occupants freedom. Freedom to rest. Freedom to think. Freedom to plan beyond the next storm. That kind of freedom changes how people live, even if they don't realize it at first. The longer the cabin stood, the more it became clear that its strength was not just physical. It quietly challenged the belief that hardship must always be met with struggle. The people who lived nearby had accepted discomfort as part of winter life. Cold floors, frozen walls, endless feeding of fires were seen as normal. The cabin suggested otherwise. It showed that hardship could be reduced, not through luxury, but through understanding. Children who grew up visiting the round cabin carried those impressions with them. They remembered how warm stone felt in January. They remembered sleeping without their breath fogging the air. Years later, when they built homes of their own, some of them unconsciously avoided sharp corners or placed their stoves more centrally. They didn't always know why. They just remembered what felt better. That is how practical knowledge survives. Not through books or lectures, but through experience. Once someone feels the difference between fighting a building and living in harmony with it, that memory becomes hard to erase. The round cabin didn't need to be copied exactly to influence behavior. Its lesson spread through instinct. As time passed, discussions about housing became more technical. People began using terms like insulation, efficiency, and design theory. But those words often described what the cabin had already demonstrated without naming it. Thermal mass. Heat distribution. Wind deflection. Passive stability. The cabin embodied those ideas long before they were formalized. There was also a quiet emotional effect. Living in a space that feels stable during chaos creates a sense of safety that goes beyond temperature. Storms sound different when you trust your walls. Wind feels less threatening when it flows around you instead of pushing against you. That emotional comfort matters, especially in isolated places where fear can grow quickly. The cabin also proved that using more material doesn't always mean wasting more. The thick stone walls seemed excessive to some, but over time they required less replacement, less repair, and less fuel. When measured across decades, the cost evened out and then favored the stone. Durability became its own kind of efficiency. Eventually, progress moved on. Railroads arrived. Towns expanded. New building methods took over. The round stone cabin faded into memory. But memory does not mean irrelevance. Every time someone questioned a drafty room or wondered why heat pooled uselessly near a ceiling, they were touching the edge of the same insight. The world has a habit of rediscovering old truths and calling them new. The cabin story fits that pattern. What once looked strange later appeared sensible. What was mocked later became measured. And what was measured became accepted. In the end, the round stone cabin was not important because it was different. It was important because it was honest. It didn't pretend the climate was kinder than it was. It didn't assume fuel was endless. It didn't rely on constant correction. It simply acknowledged reality and responded accordingly. That is why it stayed warm. That is why it endured. And that is why, even now, its lesson continues quietly, reminding anyone willing to listen that the best way to survive winter is not to fight it, but to understand it.